A ship is on fire right now in the world's most important waterway. Not from a storm, not from an accident, from Iranian missiles. The crew abandoned ship. The cargo is gone, and a message has just been delivered, not through a press release or a diplomatic cable, but through fire and smoke visible from space, that the rules of global shipping have permanently changed. Every oil company on Earth is recalculating. Every insurance market is repricing. Every government that thought this would resolve itself quietly is now facing a decision they've been desperately trying to avoid. What you're about to hear is not just another headline about Middle East tension. This is the moment the 2026 Hormuz crisis stopped being a warning and became a catastrophe. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this attack is different from everything that came before it, and why what happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether this ends at a negotiating table or spirals into something none of the parties can control. The night the IRGC crossed the line. The tanker wasn't reckless. That's the first thing you need to understand. The vessel's owners had spent weeks watching Iranian patrol patterns. They'd been in contact with maritime security consultants. They'd cleared the risk assessment with their underwriters. They picked a window they believed was manageable, and they were wrong in the most violent way possible. IRGC patrol boats intercepted the vessel before it had even completed half its transit. The radio communication came first. Stop, reverse course. You are in violation of Iranian maritime authority. The captain's response, that the vessel was exercising innocent passage rights under international maritime law, sealed the ship's fate, not because those rights don't exist. They absolutely do, codified in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But Iran had already decided that in the current conflict, international maritime law answers to the IRGC, and it was about to prove that with weapons. 2 warning shots crossed the bow, standard naval interdiction protocol. The tanker continued. What happened next was not a warning. It was a reckoning. Multiple strikes hit the hull. The engine room caught fire immediately. The blaze spread faster than the crew could contain it. The mayday went out. Lifeboats hit the water, and the tanker, loaded with crude oil, fully crewed, legally transiting an international strait, became a burning wreck visible from satellite imagery and from commercial aircraft flying overhead. The Skylight, a Palau-flagged tanker, went down with 4 of its 20 crew members injured. 15 of those crew members were Indian nationals. In a single operation, the IRGC had done what weeks of threats and interceptions hadn't. It had made the danger completely real, and what came next would rewrite the rules of global energy forever. 4 rungs on a ladder to war. To understand why this specific attack shook the world, you have to understand the escalation ladder Iran has been climbing since February 28, 2026, the day the US and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran, killing more than 300 people and wounding over 10,000 others in the opening phase of a conflict nobody had a clean playbook for. On March 2nd, Iran made its first move. Senior IRGC officials declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Officially, publicly, without apology. Not a threat, a declaration. The waterway through which 20 million barrels of oil flow every single day, through which roughly 20% of the entire world's petroleum supply passes, was now under Iranian enforcement authority. Any ship that tried to cross without IRGC permission was, in Iran's framing, a legitimate target. Rung 1, the declaration. Ships began turning back. Global oil markets jolted awake. Rung 2, active interceptions. IRGC patrol boats began stopping vessels mid-transit, radioing warnings, physically escorting ships back the way they came. No shots fired. Aggressive, humiliating, but recoverable. The world told itself this was posturing. Rung 3, warning shots. When some vessels persisted, the IRGC fired across their bows. The message was clear: we are not bluffing. Still, no ships had been permanently damaged. No crew had been killed. The fiction that this would resolve without catastrophic violence held, barely. Rung 4, live engagement. By March 6th, the IRGC struck a Marshall Islands flagged tanker in the Hormuz. By March 11th, 6 vessels had been attacked in a single day across the Gulf and the Strait. By March 12th, confirmed IRGC attacks on merchant ships had reached 21. A tugboat dispatched to rescue the Safine Prestige was hit by 2 missiles and sank, leaving 3 crew members missing. The IRGC had gone kinetic. Not occasionally, not reluctantly, but systematically. There is 1 rung left before full naval war. Iran just stepped onto it. The $2 million toll booth at the world's most dangerous crossing, here's the part your newsfeed probably buried. While the world was focused on the fires and the oil prices, Iran was quietly doing something far more calculated and far more revealing about its long-term strategy. It built a toll booth. Since March 13th, a total of 26 vessels have transited the Strait of Hormuz through a single IRGC-controlled corridor. Every one of them was required to submit full documentation to Iranian authorities, receive a clearance code, accept an IRGC escort, and travel a pre-approved route. Iran's route, not the international one. And for some of those vessels, the price of passage reportedly reached $2 million per voyage, paid in cash or cryptocurrency through intermediaries. Let that sink in. Iran is not just closing the world's most critical shipping lane, it's monetizing it. According to data tracked by the Times of India, Iran's oil revenues surged to an estimated $139 million per day in March 2026. Tehran was blocking ships headed for rival nations while preserving its own export artery. And the price discount on Iranian crude narrowed to just $2.10 per barrel versus Brent, the tightest gap in nearly a year. The IRGC isn't just enforcing a blockade, it's running the most audacious protection racket in modern maritime history. You either pay and follow IRGC orders, or you don't cross at all. And if you try to cross without paying, well, you already know what happens to those ships. Iran's parliament was reportedly drafting legislation to formally legalize these tolls, turning a de facto shakedown operation into actual Iranian law. The Fars news agency reported lawmakers were aiming to finalize the bill within days. The Strait of Hormuz, in the eyes of Tehran, had gone from an international waterway to Iranian sovereign territory, and the world hadn't figured out yet how to push back. When oil hits $126 a barrel, what actually breaks markets don't wait for analysis, they react. And what they did to global energy prices when the Hormuz closed was breathtaking in scale and speed. Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years. It didn't stop there. Prices climbed to a peak of $126 per barrel, making this the fastest surge in oil prices of any conflict in recent history. Analysts at Axios were already warning about $200 oil if the conflict dragged on without a ceasefire. The disruption removed 20 million barrels per day from accessible global markets. Global LNG supply dropped 20% in a matter of weeks. Aluminum spiked. Fertilizer prices, which feed into food prices everywhere on Earth, jumped. Helium, used in everything from MRI machines to semiconductor manufacturing, became a crisis commodity. Equity markets got hammered. South Korea's Kospi index fell 12%. Japan's Nikkei dropped 8.6%. These weren't war economies. They were modern, sophisticated, technology-intensive nations being slowly strangled by a choke point they had no military ability to independently open. China, which runs about 50% of its oil imports through the strait, faced a direct threat to industrial output and power grids that analysts warned could shave measurable points off its GDP for the year. The Lloyd's of London war risk market, already at its highest alert status since the Gulf Wars, was repricing in real time as each new attack was confirmed. Insurance coverage for Gulf transit either disappeared entirely or became so expensive that the premium exceeded the value of most voyages. If you couldn't absorb a $2 million insurance surcharge on top of a $2 million IRGC toll, you simply weren't shipping through the Hormuz. Full stop. The IEA announced an emergency release of up to 400 million barrels from member nation strategic reserves, a bandage on a wound that was widening faster than any stockpile could cover. It described the measure as temporary and warned there was an absence of a quick resolution. That was the IEA's version of saying, we don't see this ending well. The cruise nobody is talking about 15 Indian nationals, 12 Filipino seafarers, 3 Thai crew members missing after a March 11th missile strike on their tanker, 1 Filipino seafarer unaccounted for after a separate Iranian attack. These are the people being erased from the headlines in favor of oil price charts and ceasefire timelines. They are merchant mariners, not soldiers, not combatants. They are workers from the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Thailand, the backbone of the global shipping industry, men and women who took jobs moving cargo because it was how their families survived. The International Transport Workers Federation issued a stark warning after the attack on the Skylight, noting that Indian seafarers represent one of the world's largest maritime labor forces and must never be placed in harm's way. But they already had been. 4 of those 15 Indians were injured when Iranian missiles tore into the hull of a vessel they had no control over, executing orders from operators who had judged the risk manageable and were catastrophically wrong. The Philippine embassy confirmed 12 of its nationals were rescued from a separate attack near Basra, Iraq. Another Filipino seafarer went missing after Iranian forces struck a Thai-flagged cargo ship in the Strait on March 11th. Families in Manila, in Mumbai, in Karachi, and Jakarta were learning about these attacks through news alerts and emergency notifications, waiting to find out whether their fathers and brothers and sons were among the rescued or among those still unaccounted for. Maritime unions across the region were preparing statements. The ITF was filing formal objections, and under international maritime labor law, what the IRGC had just done gave every union on Earth the most powerful argument it had ever had. Crews have the legal right to refuse orders that place them in unreasonable danger. An IRGC missile strike on a civilian tanker in an international strait is the textbook definition of unreasonable danger. Even if a ceasefire came tomorrow, the shipping industry was going to need willing crews, and the IRGC had just given every maritime union on Earth the perfect reason to tell their members, don't go. The families waiting in villages across South Asia and Southeast Asia are the real cost of this conflict. They don't appear in ceasefire proposals. They don't get a seat at the table in Islamabad or Muscat or Geneva, but they are paying for every hour of this war in the hardest possible currency, and that story deserves to be told. Trump's 4 options and the ghost of the 1980s. When the White House war room gets a call that says Iran just blasted a commercial tanker, the president doesn't have the luxury of a week to decide. Trump operates fast on security. His advisors were briefing him within minutes, and the decision he made, or didn't make, would define the trajectory of this conflict more than anything that had happened since February 28th. Option 1. Hit the patrol boats that did it. Proportionate, visible, surgically justified. You attack our commercial vessels, we destroy the assets that did the attacking. The problem? Iran responds by escalating the broader military conflict in a way that makes a ceasefire even harder to achieve and gives Tehran a domestic political narrative about American aggression that it desperately needs. Option 2. Naval escort coalition. Deploy U.S. warships in the Hormuz transit corridor. Declare that any vessel transiting under American naval protection will not be touched. Trump had already floated this publicly on March 2nd, posting on Truth Social that if necessary, the United States Navy will begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible. The Wall Street Journal later confirmed the Trump administration was planning to formally announce a multi-nation coalition to escort ships. Trump told reporters he had approached roughly 7 countries to join that coalition. The risk? Iran uses American naval escorts as justification for striking American warships directly rather than civilian tankers. A leap to a level of direct superpower confrontation that neither side has explicitly reached yet. Option 3. A credible ultimatum. Deliver a specific, verifiable message to Tehran. The next attack on a commercial vessel triggers strikes against targets Iran genuinely cannot afford to lose. Not patrol boats. Strategic infrastructure. The risk is that Iran misjudges American resolve, calls the bluff, and the U.S. is forced to either follow through with escalation it was trying to avoid or back down globally. Option 4. Pure diplomatic acceleration. Treat the tanker attack as the final catalyst that forces Pakistan, China, and the broader international community to compress the ceasefire timeline from weeks to days. The risk is that Iran reads the absence of a military response as a green light, confirmation that America won't fight back for commercial vessels, removing the last deterrent against the next attack. Analysts were quick to point out the historical parallel. In 1987 and 1988, the United States reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and provided direct naval escorts through the Persian Gulf under Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. It worked, eventually, but the 2026 version had one crucial difference. Back then, Iran was an exhausted war power trying to survive a conflict with Iraq. In 2026, Iran had turned the Hormuz itself into the weapon. And unlike missiles, unlike drones, unlike proxy networks, the IRGC's ability to interdict shipping in that narrow strait couldn't be neutralized from the air. Asia on the brink, the countries paying the real price. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency. South Korea launched a nationwide mandatory energy-saving campaign. Japan was staring at a trade deficit that widened with every barrel it couldn't import. South Korea relies on the Strait of Hormuz for approximately 70% of its crude oil imports, roughly 1.7 million barrels per day. Its strategic petroleum reserves covered about 190 million barrels, giving it roughly 208 days of buffer at normal consumption levels. South Korean Prime Minister Kim Min-seok publicly warned that the government must prepare for worst-case scenarios. Emergency cabinet sessions were convening. Coal operational limits were lifted from 80% to maximum capacity. Nuclear power utilization was pushed from 70% to over 80%. The Kospi index had already bled 12% of its value. Japan's exposure was equally brutal. The country imports 1.6 million barrels of crude daily through the strait. A sustained closure would widen Japan's trade deficit sharply, weaken the yen, which was already under pressure, and tip the economy toward stagflation. Japan and South Korea both have capable naval self-defense forces. Both have been American allies watching this conflict unfold without direct military involvement. The tanker attacks created domestic political pressure in both countries for more direct engagement, whether through diplomatic firepower, financial leverage, or naval contribution to the escort coalition Trump was assembling. China, which routes approximately 50% of its oil imports through the Hormuz, faced a manufacturing sector and power grid threat that analysts warned could produce a measurable GDP contraction. China had been walking a strategic tightrope. It had not condemned Iran publicly, given long-standing economic relationships, but it had enormous exposure. Every day the strait stayed closed was a day China's industrial output depended on alternative routes that were slower, more expensive, and far less reliable. India's position was perhaps the most complicated of all. India had been managing a careful multi-alignment strategy, maintaining relationships with both Washington and Tehran. The attack on the Skylight, with 15 Indian nationals on board, 4 of them injured, forced New Delhi's hand. India's shipping ministry initially pushed back on reports of the IRGC toll system, calling claims baseless. But the images of burning Indian sailors in the strait made neutrality increasingly impossible to maintain. India sought direct talks with Tehran over Hormuz's safe passage, and Iran, in a remarkable counter-move, asked India to return 3 seized tankers in exchange. The Hormuz crisis had gone from a military confrontation to a global economic chessboard, and the pieces were moving fast. Iran's last card, and the Islamabad summit that could change everything by day, 10 of Operation Roaring Lion, the U.S.-Israeli air campaign that began February 28th, Iran's ballistic missile launch rate had collapsed by 90% from opening day. The IRGC had fired 480 missiles on the first day. By day 10, that number was below 10. The Israeli military confirmed that 75% of Iran's missile launchers had been destroyed. The White House declared Iran's ballistic missile capability functionally destroyed and its Navy combat ineffective. Drone factories had been struck, proxy supply lines severed, energy infrastructure damaged. But the Hormuz, that was something different. The IRGC's Hormuz enforcement operation is distributed, mobile, and operates in a geography that gives Iran inherent advantages that no amount of air superiority can eliminate. You can destroy missile silos from the air. You cannot destroy every small patrol boat, every IRGC frogman, every sea mine the IRGC can place in a 21-mile-wide channel on short notice. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's last credible deterrent, its nuclear option without the nuclear. Time magazine described it precisely. The strait is Iran's real nuclear option. When everything else has been bombed or degraded, the ability to turn the world's most critical energy choke point into a combat zone remains. And Iran demonstrated it with the $2 million toll booth, with 21 confirmed attacks, with burning tankers visible from satellites. The message Iran was sending to any ceasefire negotiation was clear. Whatever deal gets made must include real security guarantees for Tehran, not just a pause in airstrikes while Iran's military position continues to deteriorate. Iran wanted sanctions relief, limits on its nuclear and missile programs discussed rather than dictated, the strait reopened on terms it could sell domestically, and a recognition that it still had leverage. Iran's response to the U.S. 15-point ceasefire proposal made this explicit. Tehran rejected it outright on March 25th, counteroffering with sweeping demands that stalled the diplomatic momentum that had been building for days. Pakistan, which had been confirmed as mediating U.S.-Iran talks, with Army Chief Asim Munir using his Tehran connections and his relationship with Trump to position Islamabad as a neutral diplomatic hub, saw its most promising window suddenly close. But the story doesn't end there. On March 29, 2026, today, Pakistan is hosting a high-level diplomatic summit in Islamabad. Top diplomats from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt are arriving at the invitation of Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar. The explicit goal, a path toward ceasefire and regional stability. Trump had already announced a 5-day pause on strikes targeting Iran's energy infrastructure after what he described as very, very strong talks and major points of agreement. He described a deal as potentially within reach, while in the same breath saying, if it goes well, we're going to end up settling this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out. Meanwhile, the IRGC issued its most categorical statement yet on March 27th. Vessels linked to countries supporting Israel or the United States would not be allowed through the strait at all. Not for $2 million, not for any price. The toll booth was becoming a hard wall. Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, were watching the attacks with what could only be described as grim validation. They had been arguing throughout the conflict that Iranian behavior represented an existential threat to regional security that required more than a simple ceasefire. The attacks on commercial tankers, the toll system, the IRGC's public declarations of total Hormuz dominance, all of it strengthened the Gulf position that any settlement would need real accountability for Iran's behavior, not just a pause that allowed Tehran to reset and threaten again once pressure eased. The first is the energy clock. Every hour the strait stays closed, the global economy absorbs another jolt. Oil at 126 per barrel is already squeezing the supply chains that feed into every product you buy, every flight you take, every kilowatt of electricity you use. The IEA's emergency release of strategic reserves is buying days, not weeks. The Philippines' energy emergency is real. South Korea's grid is operating at nuclear maximum to compensate for missing crude. Japan is staring at stagflation. China's factories are running contingency plans that assume the strait won't reopen this month. The second is the military clock. Iran's conventional military has been degraded to a degree that would have been unthinkable a year ago. But the IRGC's Hormuz enforcement operation gets more brazen and more lethal with each passing week. 21 attacks confirmed by March 12th. The toll booth operational since March 13th. The IRGC declaring on March 27th that U.S.-aligned nations are completely blocked. The next escalation after this one, the one that follows a second tanker burned or a crew killed rather than injured, or an IRGC patrol boat engaging a U.S. Navy escort vessel, may be the one that produces a response that cannot be walked back. Analysts from the Washington Institute describe the military options for reopening the strait as carrying significant limitations and requiring urgent resolve. Pakistan's diplomats flying in and out of Islamabad are trying to thread a needle between two parties who both believe time is on their side, and both are wrong. Iran believes that every day the strait stays closed is a day the world pays more for its oil and pressure mounts on Washington. America believes that every day of continued airstrikes degrades Iran's ability to fight back until the IRGC's Hormuz operation becomes unsustainable. Both calculations are partially correct. Both are also ignoring the clock. Rumors have been circulating, and reports suggest that Iran's counter-proposal to the U.S. ceasefire framework includes demands so sweeping that some analysts believe they are designed to be rejected, preserving Iran's ability to blame America for failed negotiations while continuing to enforce the strait blockade. If that's the calculation, it is an extraordinarily dangerous one. Because the Trump administration has publicly vowed naval escorts, assembled a seven-nation coalition, and established the domestic political precedent that American credibility is directly tied to ensuring the free flow of energy through the Hormuz. Walking away from that without a deal is not an option Washington can politically survive. The world's most important 21 miles of ocean are now a war zone with a toll booth run by a regime that has nothing left to lose except the one weapon that still works. And the summit happening in Islamabad right now, today, is the best shot anyone has at keeping the next escalation from being the last one.